What music do we listen to, play, and think about during this pandemic? The coronavirus has wreaked havoc across the globe. It has caused fear to ripple out across society, and we are isolated and surrounded by an invisible plague. And of course, in our isolation, we need music. Not just a music to entertain us and to humor us, but a music that resonates with this crisis. So what music would speak meaningfully to us during this time of COVID-19? I have been particularly drawn to the music of Schubert, of late Schubert, because this is a music that is equally lonely and isolated, a music that is not so much surrounded by plague, but by death. Schubert faces this tragedy, this reality, and yet the music is able to be deeply consoling. It seemed to me to be very appropriate for this time. So I have been playing the 4 impromptus, and I have been drawn particularly to the first one in C minor. In 1827, when Schubert composed the C minor impromptu, he was already well aware of his own illness and that he would face death soon. And this piece of music, although I don't think it's biographical, is tinged with that sense of foreboding, that sense of nostalgia for all that could have been but never was, that sense in which death is going to take something away. Before I even started playing the piece, I was struck by the tempo marking. Allegro, molto, moderato. Allegro, molto, moderato. What does that even mean? I mean, how can this music even be an allegro? If anything, it's a kind of slow death march. If you played the theme fast, allegro, it would just sound silly, like this. In fact, the tempo in most modern recordings of this piece is seldom molto moderato. It is more often an adagio or a lento or even grave. But these performances are not necessarily wrong. The key is to understand that Schubert is operating in 2 different time zones simultaneously. It's an allegro because this is a kind of driving force, a relentless driving force towards death. And yet somehow the intensity of that speed is stretched out so that it lingers as a kind of relentless lingering, fast and slow at the same time. This is both a funeral march and a quick march. It's a funeral march in the sense that you're contemplating it, but it is a quick march in the sense that it is an inevitable drive towards death. It is, in reality, slow, but psychologically, it's moving way too fast. In fact, you can't even play the first chord of this piece allegro. It's neither allegro nor is it molto moderato, because it's just a very long pause on this G octave. And yet, underlying this octave, Schubert is saying it's an allegro, because this G has an agitated, relentless, driving character to it. You see, the G has always been there, and when this deathly march-like theme reappears in the middle of the impromptu, this G is revealed as this agitated allegro that was there from the very first chord. This becomes this. So that G then becomes this gnawing death toll, and it becomes louder and louder. And then it becomes more and more dissonant. Dissonant, 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 dissonant. And that hollow, empty fifth again. This G octave at the very beginning of the piece isn't just Schubert trying to get your attention. No, this G is a stab that gets right to the heart. It is the searing realization of tragedy. It is not so much death as the revelation of its imminent inevitability. G is the beginning of the end. And there is no escape from this wound inflicted at the very start. So when you play this G, it has to be of a devastating force. It is stark, bare, ruthless. It is an attack. The G then acts as a kind of gravitational force, and all the harmonic material will orbit around this force. But there is no escape for this material. It'll be sucked in as the G collapses into its final tonic. The same can be said for this march theme, this death march theme. Now, some commentators think that this is a theme for variation, but actually this theme remains the same. It appears 3 times at the beginning, middle, and end, and each time it's in the same key and it's the same material. It doesn't really undergo variation. It too functions as a kind of gravitational force, and all the other thematic material orbits around it. It tries to escape this force, but it can't do it. It too gets sucked in to its darkness. This theme is inevitable. The main theme is quite unusual. It's a march, but it begins as a march for just one person. It's a lonely voice, more akin to one of Schubert's wanderers than to a recruit for some kind of military campaign. And it's a march that doesn't really want to march. The phrase just hovers on the dominant in a very solitary way. It wants to leave the question open. It doesn't want to answer the question. But inevitably, there is an answer, and the second phrase is a march. And it begins with these staccatos. The staccato for me indicates that this is a march that is indifferent. It doesn't really care. It's just going to keep marching on and on. This is death as objectivity. It's not even particularly scary at this stage. It's just an objective fact of life. The solitary phrase returns again, as if it really doesn't want to hear that answer. This time it returns as a more intense voice, slightly more expressive, more demonstrative. It really doesn't want to hear the answer. It wants to keep things hovering in mid-air as an open question. But the answer is inevitable. It comes as if from the distance, from some kind of military wind band coming over the hill. And it's calling this individual, join me, join the march. It's inevitable. Come. The theme then repeats itself. But now it's accompanied by new harmonies that are expressive of individual yearning. It's a very romanticized version of this deathly march. And then it's drawn back in to the normal march. But the reply is devastating, forte. And you hear this hollow, empty, deathly sound in the bass. Now, in this opening section, the theme has been played twice, and it hasn't gone anywhere. We've had 4 cadences, and they've all gone to the tonic, C minor, and each time it gets louder. The message is clear. That quiet little voice at the opening is overwhelmed by that sense of finality. And just to bring the point home, Schubert pounds out that cadence. And here it is again and again and again. We might as well end the piece here. We are at the end, and you cannot get out. Just because the world is collapsing in around you with those colossal chords doesn't mean that you cannot escape within yourself, within your own imagination, and disappear from reality. The music doesn't want to be trapped in the C minor march, this ominous cadence needs to be transformed. And so the individual subject tries to move it out of that C minor orbit. And here we swerve harmonically into a kind of Never Never Land. And we're now in A flat major. Now, the theme, that funeral march, is now transformed into a song. Notice that the left hand has been transformed into something that is the complete opposite of a march. It has become fluid, watery. The song is accompanied by the river of life instead of this march of death. So in one sense, this military landscape is superimposed with a pastoral scene. And nature, which is normally indifferent to the human, becomes a source of beautiful consolation. And these expressive nuances in the left hand, the inflections, the chromatic inflections, and the appoggiaturas and the suspensions, they express, they reflect the soul of the wanderer. And somehow this river is able to flow, as it were, around all the different obstacles thrown up by the march. Instead of plodding in a straight line towards death, the wanderer, this romantic soul, is able to meander with the river towards distant, far-off places, places of the imagination. So instead of overcoming death with a kind of resistance, instead of trying to struggle with it, what Schubert does is to fight death through reminiscence. Not resistance, but reminiscence. It's a place of memory, a place of thinking about happiness that maybe never was, never really existed, but should have been, could have been. Instead of doing this, does this. And we are in C flat major. This is not even B major. Schubert ensures that this is written out in C flat major, as if he wanted to show this imagined happiness as the underbelly of C minor. It sort of clings to the bottom of that deathly C minor march as this sense of reminiscence, this memory, this happiness that is underlying the march. Schubert wants to be as far away as possible from the reality of C minor. I am not in C minor. I imagine myself in C flat major. At this point, the music even takes on an air of confidence. It is noble, almost heroic. So this song is now cadencing in A flat major. But something extraordinary happens. So here we have a figure that Mahler would make famous as the quintessential romantic motif of infinite yearning. But it's already here in Schubert. This figure, this turn at the end of this cadence doesn't want to end. It doesn't want to cadence. So Schubert makes this cadence figure into a theme. It just keeps going. To me, this section is the strangest part of the impromptu. It seems to me that the music doesn't seem to quite fit. It seems to be interpolated, as if sort of plonked in from the outside. And this, I think, is because the music doesn't want to belong to this death march. It's a music that wants to escape. It's an infinite sense of yearning that wants to get out of the piece. And of course, there is no escape, because that G is going to return and nail every single nail into the coffin. We know that when the marching theme returns in the middle of the impromptu, it is a hellish experience. Not only is the G gnawing inside you as this throbbing pain of fear, it is now descending chromatically, as if drawing you deeper and deeper into the depths. It becomes this chromatic line. And as it progresses, it becomes more and more intense. It is dragging you into Hades. You can literally feel the gravitational force of this bass. And here, we have this figure that feels as if the music is drilling you deeper and deeper into the earth. And it just keeps going. And as the bass is drilling down, pulling you into hell, those colossal cadences that you heard earlier when the theme first appears, now comes as these apocalyptic fanfares, these trumpets of judgment, calling its judgment down upon you. With these apocalyptic fanfares, it is as if the music was saying that the fear that you have of your own insignificant death is like the end of the world. And to add insult to injury, do you remember that moment when you tried to escape into Never Never Land? That D flat that helped you to get out of C minor, well, it's incorporated into these thunderous cadences as a Neapolitan chord. As if to say, that futile attempt at escape with your little D flat is already in my grasp. Not surprisingly, when the Song of Reminiscence returns, it is now caught in the orbit of C minor. It is going to collapse into that black hole. Not only is it now in the minor, but it has been infected by that G, that original chord at the beginning, because the song is now in G minor and it can hardly sing. In fact, it is at this point that the music sounds like an allegro. The music is scurrying, and those syncopated bass notes indicate that it's out of breath, it's running, it's escaping, but there is nowhere to hide. Ironically, the song of reminiscence that the wanderer was singing, following that stream, meandering off into these distant places so far away from C minor, ironically, the wanderer realizes that all tributaries eventually lead to one river. In trying to run off in the opposite direction, he ends up in the very place that he does not want to be. You see, if you want to run away from C minor, the last place you want to be is in the dominant, in G minor. Because strategically, once you're there, you're trapped. It's game over. So this song of reminiscence, for all its consolation, all its self-confidence, collapses into fear and trembling, into anxiety and terror. It is literally terrorized by G minor. And the only section of the song that remains intact is that moment at the end of infinite longing. And now, of course, it is more intense than ever, because now this imagined parallel universe of happiness has turned its back on the wanderer and will disappear into nothing. In the tonal system, when your theme gets into the dominant, there's only one place for it to go. The dominant in this case, of course, is this G, and it can only go to the tonic C. Now, this theme of infinite yearning is now in G major. So it's the easiest thing for this theme to fall, almost by accident, into the clutches of that death march. And here we are. When that death march theme appears in its final iteration at the end of this impromptu, it sounds as if it's taking on that hellish manifestation that it had earlier on in the middle of the piece. But actually, there's something different about it, even though it sounds the same. If you look carefully at the key signature, we're no longer in C minor. Schubert has taken away all those flats, and we are technically in C major, even though it sounds almost exactly the same. as with the Allegro molto moderato, where Schubert was operating in 2 time zones at the same time, both slow and fast. So here, Schubert is operating in 2 modes at the same time. It is both major and minor. So in reality, we hear this in the minor, but we are to think this simultaneously in the major as a bittersweet experience. So the music has been transfigured from C minor to C major. That world of darkness has become a world of light. But this C major light isn't the same C major light that you get in Haydn's creation. Let there be light. No, it's not even the same C major light that you get at the end of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, a light of glory and victory. With Schubert, when it comes to C major, this transfiguration from minor to major, it's kind of creepy. It's not a resolution at all. It's more a sense of ambivalence, because we're never quite sure that we are really in C major. It's always this mixture between minor and major. But this modal mixture is not really the right term here. It's not a mixture. It's more a tension, an ambivalence, a vacillation, an oscillation. So we're filled with both gratefulness and regret, with both a sense of consolation and a sense of bitter irony, of both care and also callousness, concern and indifference. It's an uncanny, creepy C major world that we have entered. So in the second half of the impromptu, the song that was in a major key is now in a minor key, and the march that was in a minor key is now in a major key. So the impromptu structure is really a flip, and kind of negative image of modalities. Now when the march appears in the major, it's never quite sure whether it's really in C major. It's often this double-headed beast. It may begin in the minor and then end in the major, or somehow in the middle, it just wants to keep creeping towards the minor. But there is one phrase that is perfectly in the major. But that phrase is probably the creepiest phrase of all, because it is just so normal. In this purely C major section, the first phrase is very strange because it is almost entirely devoid of expression marks. It is as if Schubert just wants you to play this in a straightforward, pedestrian manner, as if nobody really cares. The chill of death is still there. This is to be played objectively, not sentimentally. In the next phrase, there's a little bit more emotional intensity. But then it sinks back into that normal, everyday, mundane world again. And it begins with a little bit of a Viennese waltz. And it ends with a rather cute, quaint, kitsch cadence. It's this line in the bass that makes it seem so weird, as if the world was just carrying on its business as usual, and nobody really cares about your little bit of suffering. So it's just an objective, happy smile that is more eerie than consoling. In the next phrase, Schubert transposes up an octave. It elevates the music up here, but still highly expressive. It is as if the music has left the body. It's a kind of out-of-body experience, as if the music was looking down on the march. It's very eerie. In this light, life, even death, seems a bit banal. And in this impromptu, C major with its white note purity is as much about cold indifference, like this blank white wall, as it is about stillness, resting in peace. But this is no longer the consolation of nature. No, this is a detachment from nature, a detachment from earthly concerns and from material being. The minor inflections that return, like painful twinges in the following phrases, are an expression of this inability to let go of this material world. The music wants to reach out and hold on, even if it means holding on to that pain, holding on to the somatic pangs of lament. The final phrase of the march before the coda is basically one long cadence, stretched out between this tension of heaven and hell. So just as there was an allegro and a molto moderato happening at the same time, and the major and the minor mode sounding at the same time, so here we have a music that is being stretched upwards and downwards at the same time. Now, in terms of the downward pull, it is the same chromatic motive in the bass, pulling the music down. It is as if the music is trying to pull the material body down into the earth as some kind of decaying corpse. On the other hand, we have the soul trying to rise up, trying to float, as it were, in a haze of C major. And so the music at the top oscillates between E natural and E flat as it seeks a way of finding that C major peace. Between these two tensions then, the cadence is being elongated, giving the sense of a finality that doesn't quite want to end. It is always ending. So by the time that it actually manages to cadence, you have this enormous sense of release. And here we are, C major. But this cadence doesn't belong to the march. It's the cadence from that infinite theme of yearning. It is as if Schubert has put the march theme and the song theme together. There's some kind of a synthesis going on here, as if they've reached some kind of truce, some kind of a resolution. There's a kind of requiem, a kind of rest at this point. But we shouldn't get too sentimental about this, because in the little coda that follows, that tolling bell of death is still there. These final death tolls are a fulfillment of that gutting realization at the beginning of the imminence of death. And then that minor jab on E flat is still here. And then the cadence. Now notice that this cadence has those staccatos that we heard from the very beginning. It is to be played in a detached manner, not just literally played in a detached manner, but psychologically too, because death is also something that is detached, the objectivity of death. A fact of life. And Schubert wants you to play it in that way. And then the C major cadence again, with those staccatos. And again. That objective chill of death is still there. And it is only that final cadence where Schubert takes away the staccato, giving it a little bit of warmth. That human touch at the end, that little bit of warmth, gives a glimmer of hope and solace to this devastating piece. There's something deeply consoling about the final chords, despite those jabs in the minor mode and the continuing tolling bells of death that persist all the way to the end of this impromptu. Schubert comes to terms with reality. He makes peace with tragedy.